Good afternoon, everybody. What's happening? What's going on? What's up? This your girl Tiffany coming through here live in effect. Coming through live in effect. Thank y'all for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share the channel, like the channel, all that great stuff. All right, so continuing where I left off on a series about black psychologists, psychiatrists, and civil rights activists. So this next one I'm going to be talking about is Francis Cecil Sumner. Okay, so Francis Cecil Sumner is considered as the father of black psychology. All right, so just previously, a couple of videos back, I did a video about Joseph White, who was considered as the godfather of black psychology. But Francis Cecil Sumner is considered as the father of black psychology. So what I'm gonna do is, right, I have a few sources here that I can go through, but to make it easier, like I said, I like to go through Wikipedia because I know a lot of people can get that information that way. You know what I'm saying? It's a lot more accessible. And then I will back up with other sources as well to, validate the information that's coming from Wikipedia. But thank y'all for coming through, and make sure y'all subscribe and share the channel, like the channel, all that great stuff. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me pull up my screen. All right, so as you can see, that's my screen right there. So Francis Sumner, and his name was Francis Cecil Sumner, and he was born December 7, 1895. He died January 11, 1954. And he was an American leader in education reform. He is commonly referred to as the father of black psychology. He is primarily known for being the first African American to receive a PhD in psychology. All right, that was in 1920. He worked closely with G. Stanley Hall during his time at Clark University, and his dissertation published in Pedagogical Seminary, which later became the Journal of Genetic Psychology, focused on psychoanalysis of Freud and Adler. All right, so which I have that information right here, his dissertation. All right, anyway, so we'll go into that. So he was born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He was the second son of David Alexander and Ellen Lillian Sumner, and younger brother of Eugene Sumner. So Sumner attended elementary school in Norfolk, Virginia, and Plainville, New Jersey. His parents were concerned about the poor quality of education opportunity for African Americans, so they worked particularly hard to provide Francis with books and other materials, and they encouraged him to educate himself as they had done. All right, they developed his assignments and supervised his progress. Sumner never received a formal post-primary education. Sumner's applications to school would read private instruction in secondary subjects by father with no high school diploma. Sumner was required to take an examination to see if he was suitable to be admitted to Lincoln College, which is now Lincoln University, in Chester County, Pennsylvania, the first institution dedicated to and primary for African Americans in the United States. Sumner passed the test, and in 1911, at the age 15, was admitted. So now, as you can see, right, he was homeschooled by his parents. He never went to a secondary school. So all his education was by his parents because they did not like the education quality that African Americans were receiving in secondary schools. So they took it upon themselves to make sure that he got the proper education that he needed. So they, especially his father. So his father was the one that was really behind all of this. His reason why he became such a prodigy. So he was admitted to college at the age of 15 at Lincoln University because he passed his exams. Now, I mean, imagine a kid being homeschooled, right? You have no high school diploma. You have never went to post-secondary school, but you're able to pass the exam. So obviously, his parents took the time out and they value his education. They took it very seriously, and they made sure that he took it seriously as well. All right. So Now, going down to formal education, he graduated as a valedictorian from Lincoln College, magna cum laude in philosophy with special honors in English, modern languages, and Greek, studying also Latin and philosophy in 1915. All right. Sumner then went to Clark University in 1916, and in the fall, he received his second bachelor's degree in English. There, he developed a mentor-mentee relationship with the president of Clark, which is G. Stanley Hall. Okay. All right. So Sumner also developed a relationship with James P. Porter, the dean of Clark University and professor of psychology. Hall and Sumner's relationship became one of mutual respect as Hall continued to provide encouragement to Sumner and many other African American students. Sumner graduated from Clark University in 1916 with a bachelor's degree, a bachelor's of art in English. Okay, so anytime you see BA, that means bachelor's of art. If you see BS, that means bachelor's of science. All right. All right, so he returned to Lincoln University and graduated as a graduate student and as a teacher of religious studies, psychology, philosophy, and German. So he was a polymath, like many African Americans were. And it was at that time that Sumner began to consider advancing his study into psychology. So Sumner kept in contact with Hall, asking for assistance and consideration for a fellowship award to study race psychology at Clark University. This later became his area of focus as he worked towards the understanding and elimination of racial bias in the administration of justice. All right, so he had returned to Clark University in 1917, where he awarded a senior scholarship. All right, Hall approved his application for a PhD in psychology. His education was postponed in 1918 when he was drafted by the United States military. He was sent to Camp Meade, Maryland, for basic training with the 48th Company, 154th Deport Barricade, and Sumner was sent to the battlefield in Germany, and in his time there, he kept contact with his mentor, G. Stanley Hall. Sumner asked to be reconsidered as a candidate upon his return. Sumner remained in France until he was discharged in the middle of 1919. After his doctoral dissertation entitled Psychoanalysis of Freud and Adler was accepted, he received his doctorate degree from Clark University in 1920, June 14, making him the first African American to receive a PhD in psychology. So now, as you can see, it go down talking about his career. Okay. So his career was an area of investigating how to refute racism and bias in theories used to conclude the inferiority of African Americans. Sumner's work is thought to be a response to Eurocentric methods of psychology. All right. So he was basically trying to combat against the Eurocentric ideology when it came to dealing with psychology. So he wanted to deal with something that was specifically dealing with the psychology of African Americans. And he felt like he couldn't just take on the European narrative. So that's one of the reasons why he studied European psychology, so he can be able to develop his own and be able to develop his own understanding and interpretation of African Americans and the psychoanalysis of African Americans, etc. Um, Okay, so Sumner accepted a professor position at Wilberforce University in 1920, while at Wilberforce, Sumner was a professor of psychology and philosophy. And in 1921, he went to teach at Southern University in Louisiana at a HBCU. In fall of 1921, he accepted a position at West Virginia Collegiate Institute, where he wrote many articles dealing with the state of colleges and acceptance of African Americans or the lack thereof. Sumner used these articles to support and raise awareness for views brought up by Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. He remained for the next 7 years. Over time, he failed to receive funding for his research. He claimed that race prejudice was the cause of his inability to obtain his and other African American scientists funding. In his time at these universities, he faced financial difficulty because white research agencies refused to provide funding for him. Mm. All right. So Sumner resigned from West Virginia Collegiate Institute on August 31st of 1928. He then moved on to Howard University in the fall of 1928 and became the acting chairman professor until 1930, upon which time he became the fully appointed chair of psychology and succeeding in making the department independent from philosophy. Sumner held the position until he died on January the 12th of 1954. Okay, so we're gonna skip all of this, and then we're gonna go down to his personal life. All right, and then we're gonna come back into the concept about the Negro education. All right. So his personal life. So Sumner married Francine H. Huston in 1922. The marriage ended in divorce. He then married Nettie M. Broker in 1946. He had no children. Sumner died of a heart attack while shoveling snow outside his home in Washington, D.C. on January 11, 1954. He received a military honor guard in memory for his service during World War I. Sumner was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. Many students describe Dr. Sumner as a low-key and very dedicated, as a very quiet and very unassuming individual who was brilliant with tremendous capacity to make an analysis of individuals' gestalt, and as Howard's most stimulating scholar. All right, so as you can see down here, you can always look at the reference at the bottom of the page, so you find all the references that you want to look for. Okay, and you got the further reading. Then you got the external links right here at the bottom. All right, so let's go ahead and let's look at. All right, so let's look at the files where it says Cecile Sumner and his views and influence on African American higher education. So this was written by Thomas F. Sawyer from North Central College. Okay, so this was written in, I think, yeah, this was copyrighted in 2000. Okay. All right, so it goes in talking about during the mid 1920s, Francis Cecile Sumner, the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology, published 2 articles concerning strategies for the higher education of African American youth. These articles called for a system of segregated education, emphasizing an industrial style advocated by Booker T. Washington, as well as suggesting a measure of character development. The justification cited by Sumner for such unequal education for African Americans was the cultural inferiority of that population. The present article argues that Sumner's establishment, with the purpose of generating political and economic support for any type of higher education for African Americans. Evidence drawn from Sumner's early education and his graduate school days at Clark University, as well as testimonial from colleagues and students, are provided in support of this hypothesis. All right, so let's go down to where they talk about the views on Negro education. So at the outset of his article, Philosophy of Negro Education, Sumner described a series of stages in human civilization and cultural attainment. He went on to describe whites as banner bearers of Western civilization, whereas African Americans were a culturally younger race, only 300 years from savagery and 60 from bondage. All right. This led him to question the feasibility of equal education for the two races. All right. So in an intriguing passage, Sumner reiterate a position previously expressed by Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, referring to the education of African Americans during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Sumner wrote that the formal education granted him has not materially differed from that for whites, and that education of the Negro fails of its fundamental purpose, which neglects the fact that the Negro as a people is on a lower cultural level than the white race. Thus, according to Sumner, the appropriate strategy would be to provide an education that would have as its primary purpose the gradual elevation of the race through the fundamental stage of cultural evolution. So finally, Sumner supported Washington's emphasis on establishing industrial form of higher education for African Americans that stressed training in agricultural and various trades such as carpentry, plumbing, and masonry. So if you guys don't know that Tuskegee Institute was really the main purpose of the school being into existence was to educate African Americans about the agricultural institution. That's what the main purpose was. It was more so dealing with agricultural concepts, so it could teach African Americans about growing your own food. Also, doing all type of farming work, etc. All right, so that was one of the main thing that Booker T. Washington wanted black people to do. He wanted black folks to become self-sufficient. That's his whole aim. Be self-sufficient, do more for yourself. All right. And so Sumner pretty much stand on that view with Booker T. Washington. He understood that position, that where he was coming from, as far as being able to do for yourself and provide for yourself, etc. So, but he was basically saying that as African Americans, and we can see that to this day, we are culturally underdeveloped. So white people has been put on the pedestal as highly culturally developed, etc. Whereas black people, we're just underdeveloped when it comes to culture, because we're lacking cultural continuity. And that's where he was at. We're lacking cultural continuity. We lacking a cultural foundation. All right. Um, And then going down to where it says, in addition to recounting the views of Washington, Sumner described the position of another African American social scientist, G.V. Cools, on the importance of emphasizing the building of character in the education of African American youth. Those aspects of character which Cools believed needed to be stressed in the formal education of African American includes to tell and live the truth fiercely, to be morally clean, to love hard work, to be independent, to respect the rights of other fellow, to make the golden rule the very essence of life. Seeming to go further than Cools, Sumner suggests a biological basis for African American inferiority by writing that time has to be allowed for the natural selection of the socially fit, and that sociological statistics support the contentions that the lower instinct in the Negro still deify moral hardness. Finally, it is interesting to note that Cools was outspoken in his belief that a significant component of African American education should be the development of racial pride. He called for an education that would counteract what he called a destructive propaganda, namely the belief inherited from slavery in the superiority of the white man. And he wrote that there is no greater enemy nor a more formidable obstacle in the black man's path of progress than this inherent curse. Sumner's comment on this issue was that there should be an enthusiastic acclaim of those members of the race who make genuine contribution to cultural progress. All right. So as you can see, that's where he was standing on his position. All right. So basically what he was saying is that because we're lacking cultural continuity, right? And we dealing with cultural deprivation as a people, we need to build some type of foundation that's centered around our culture ideology. It's centered around us, something that we can relate to, something that we can fall back on. Okay. So again, you can also find this right here on the Wikipedia article. All right. So where he spoke on this, see, let's go to the Wikipedia article where it says some of the scientific record was outstanding, but it was through his effort to build and promote better education for African Americans that he made the most significant impact. Sumner was a staunch supporter of African American education. He advocated for more funding for African American schools and teachers, and he taught at Howard University for over 30 years. In 1926, Sumner viewed the African American culture as younger, as it was only a few hundred years removed from savagery and less than a century from slavery, while those of whites was more a pinnacle of Western civilization. With that in mind, he felt that many inadequacy existed between the teaching methods of African American. Sharing the same stance as Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, Sumner emphasized the need for education to customize for African education. All right, and then what else it says? So basically, what it says in the Wikipedia article is also go back to what it says in this article right here. Okay. So the title of this article is Francis Cecil Sumner, His View on Influence on African American Higher Education, Thomas F. Sawyer. All right. So it was written in 2000 under History of Psychology. And right here you can see where it says white historians were charged for being biased with negligence in omitting significant portion of Black history from their writings. Sumner mentioned that the Negro race cannot be denied that it has produced individuals whose cultural status plainly warrants a higher education. He concluded that for those very few Black youths ready for a liberalized education, it'll be best to work out in institutions, preferably for Negroes in so-called Negro colleges or universities. All right, so some of the views on Negro education grew attention and criticism from individuals and organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who were concerned that Sumner were advocating for perpetually segregated educational systems. Well, in a nutshell, he was. He was basically saying that, okay, we need to get something that's primary cater to African Americans. We need to just really focus on African Americans educational level and get them more advanced. That's what he was focusing on. So he stayed in the same position as Booker T. Washington, and also he was staying in the same position as Carter G. Woodson, because Carter G. Woodson was far more radical than this man was. I mean, he was very adamant to the point that he studied a lot on African American history, and he was determined to make sure that Black people knew that. And he felt like Black people really need to know their damn history. So he was big on education. So you will say that this man right here will represent a form of Black nationalism. All right. So Francis Cecil Sumner will represent what we call today Black nationalism, just like Booker T. Washington, and just like Marcus Garvey, and just like Carter G. Woodson. They will represent Black nationalism, okay? Or Afrocentricity, right? I mean, well, not Afrocentricity, but more so Black nationalism. That's what they will represent today in modern time. And any Black person that stood on those principles of Black nationalism and advocating for Black education, Black institution, and Black people being just totally, having their own system, then they were looked at as being too radical and becoming very problematic. All right. So let's go ahead and go to the next thing. So again, this is a short essay by James A. Bolton. This was written on October the 1st of 1979. So it's basically just giving an account of biography life of Francis Sumner. So just giving an account of his life and his biography, etc. Same thing that I was reading from Wikipedia, you can also find on here. So it can be found under dh.howard.edu, dh.howard.edu. All right. So New Direction, Volume 7, Issue Number 1, Article 2. So let's go down here to the book that he written, well, basically his dissertation. So the dissertation is called The Psychoanalysis of Fraud and Adler, or Sex Determinism and Character Formation, by Francis Cecil Sumner. All right. So what I'm going to do is So this is very interesting, right? So he was dealing with the genetic components and dealing with behavior traits, characteristic traits of male and females. Oh my goodness. Hold up. Okay, so it takes a minute to load up, but anyways, let's go to the first one. It says the question of sex determinism is both biological and psychological. The psychological aspect of the problem is of very great import for our knowledge of the variance in humans' character type, as fingerprints of not two individuals are exactly alike according to Bertillon, so also not two individuals are completely alike in character or diathesis. This infinity of individual differences signifies that according to the bisexual theory of was it Phyllis and Habalian and Harrisfield, there are no two individuals in whom the particular fusion of masculinity and femininity is this identical for each. Thus, in a dynamic sense, character or diothesis is particular fusion of masculinity and femininity within a particular individual. Mm. So every individual is a duplex. Example, both masculine and femininity, a psyche, if not a somatic pseudo hermaphrodite. In each bisexual assembled, there is a dominant and a recessive sexuality. It is this dominant sexuality, whether masculine or feminine, which is more conspicuous in the individuality and which leads common parlance to speak of an individual as male or female, unmindful of the deeper complexity of human nature. There is no absolute male or female, but only approximation thereto involves the formation of a working hypothesis. Thus, the relative sex determinism within the individual character is a matter of the ratio of masculinity to femininity within such a tone as such a one. This amounts to saying in the form of a law that in man the increase in masculinity is inversely proportional to the decrease in femininity, and in the woman the increase of femininity is inversely proportional to the decrease in masculinity. Mm. So it said these generalizations already set forth by Oder Winger lack merely the biological and psychological support which shall herewith be present. For sake of clearness, this evidence may be divided into two categories: the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic. So he goes into the phylogenetic. He says when the phylogenetic, with the principle of Medellin inherent is applied to the evolution of the two sexes, the results are significant for the bisexual theory. The so-called male and female of the species have descended from a remote common ancestor in the microorganic realm. According to Belfield, this far off ancestor of the two sexes, while hermaphroditic in the main, nevertheless bore more points of similarity to our so-called female than our so-called male, and for that reason he preferred to indicate femaleness as the dominant Medellin character, maleness as the recessive Medellin character. From this primitive common parent of the two sexes were evolved the two lines, one in the masculine, where am I? Yeah, one in the masculine direction and one in the feminine direction. The respective goal of these two evolving lines are conceived as approximation to absolute masculinity and absolute femininity. After the two sexes were evolved, after i.e., after the division into male and female according to the primary sex character, their reciproculated in each of the two sexes the evolutionary process which had gone on before the evolution of the two sexes. The masculine line again differentiate itself into the more masculine as recessive line and into more feminine as dominant line. The feminine line differentiate itself into more masculine as recessive line and into a more feminine as a dominant line. All right, so this secondary differentiation deals with the secondary, tertiary, etc. sex characters. So a genealogical tree of the evolution of the sexes based on Mendelian inheritance might here serve to clear up the foregoing. So right here, as you can see, there's a list of bisexual character types. So it says the males in who masculinity predominates, the male in who femininity predominates, the female in who masculinity predominates, and the female in who femininity predominates. All right, so I'm trying to scroll down here. All right, so basically, so as you can see, he talks more into about the hermaphrodites. So it's not really a term anymore because it's considered as offensive. So now it's called intersex. So you got people who are born as intersex, meaning that they are born with both organs, both the male and female organs, etc. Um, and they could develop, more hormone characteristic than the other, right? But I think also in this article, he also makes the argument that as people who are biologically male and biologically females, that we develop both characteristics of both sexes. So you might have a female that is born as a female, but she has a predominantly a male characteristic or masculinity characteristic and less of feminine characteristic. And you got a male who is predominantly a male, but he has a lot more female characteristic and less of male characteristics, right? So, and then you got the female who has predominantly of a feminine characteristic and less masculinity, and the same vice versa for the male, more masculine characteristic, less feminine characteristic, etc. All right, so this is, this has been an ongoing science study as far as like characteristic wise, from the biological species. So like basically it's saying that every female may not be so feminine like, okay, and every male may not be so masculine, you know. So one, you may have one trait than the other, and that's what you have to learn as far as nature is concerned. So you can kind of interpret that as this going into the form of trying to validate homosexuality or whatever the case may be. Um, but I don't think it's the validation of homosexuality per se. I think it's just looking at characteristic and just behavior, how how human species, right, operate within nature, and just saying that as humans we all don't operate the same way. You know what I'm saying? We have our own traits of how we go about dealing with our environment and how we deal with living in our environment, etc. All right, so yeah, also to kind of piggyback up, I think people need to read the book about the male brain and female brain. Let me look up the name of the author. All right, so I recommend people get this book right here. It's called The Male Brain. A breakthrough understanding of how men and boys think by Luann Bird. Was it Breezadine? I think that's how you say her last name, Breezadine. Yeah, Luann Breezadine. So, and she also wrote a book called The Female Brain too, as well. So basically, she breaks down biological characteristic of the male and the female, and how our brains function differently as far as like how we think and how we respond to things, and it's also as far as our emotional characteristic, etc. So yeah, the name of the author is Luann Brizardine, and you can also find her on YouTube as well. But with that being said, that's the information. And that is a picture over here. This is a picture of Francis Cecile Sumner. Okay, that's him right here on the left corner. All right. So with that being said, you guys, thank you for tuning in, watching, listening to my channel. If you guys want to look up more contents, you can check that out for yourself. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, share my channel, like my channel, all that great stuff. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Be safe out here. Be productive. Peace and power and elevation. Be to every last one of you. And until next time, be safe. All right.